Thank you. It is such an honor to be here and to share this wonderful celebration of Professor Bawa with you. He might not know this, but for at least 20 years, probably more, I've looked up to him as my idol for doing great science and great conservation and melding the two in such a beautiful way. So thank you for that. And he was also one of the early proponents of the idea that conservation and people's livelihoods and well-being go together hand in hand, and that's what I want to talk about today with relation to urbanization. So in addition to climate change as a big global force that we've discussed today, urbanization is another major global change around the world, and we can see it here in Bangalore, of course, and currently, India's population is about 30% urban and expected to increase in the future. So while urbanization in India is not as fast as some other places, it is certainly a major, major force. So we can ask ourselves, how does that change the urban-rural dynamic? How does that change the way people use forests? Is this urbanization, in fact, an opportunity for conservation and saving India's forests? So the narrative from North America and Western Europe is that the process of urbanization and transformation from agricultural to industrial to service economy goes along with freeing up land that then can be rewilded, and that is somewhat the story of the Northeast US. And that narrative has made its way into the literature, made its way into the popular media, as you can see here. And that would be nice. That would be a great opportunity for conservation without a lot of big effort if it were indeed true. So I'd like to ask, in a particular landscape where I work in India, whether we can expect this narrative that is played out in other parts of the world to play out in that landscape. So I'm going to go to, I'm going to go to central India, which has been touched upon a bit here. This is not the Western Ghats, it's not the Northeast, it doesn't have the same biodiversity and endemism, but it is a globally important conservation landscape for large carnivores. It's the water tower for many important rivers that feed downstream agriculture and cities, and it is home to many tribal populations across the tribal belt, and it's also a place I love dearly. So that's the focus here, is this area in central India where there's dry tropical deciduous forests. So in this region, as I'm sure you all are familiar, people are heavily dependent on forest resources for fuel wood, for grazing, for forest products, for income generation, and this is home to some of the most marginalized populations in the country, and highly, highly dependent on forests. So people's well-being is very closely entwined with the health of the forest and people's access to the forest. So we set out to answer this question. Oops. No, this is going to work. There we go. We set out to answer this question about this process of urbanization. So through urbanization and jobs created in urban areas, can that take people off the landscape as they move to take advantage of these urban opportunities? So we surveyed 5,000 households across this landscape to look at the migration patterns. Are people actually moving off the landscape? Are they reducing their dependence on forest resources? Are they changing their livelihood strategies? And is that an opportunity for conservation if people are becoming less dependent on forest resources? So we surveyed these households that fringe the forest. So you can see here where the distribution of those households are, and asked people about their use of forests, their migration patterns, who's migrating in their household, when they started to migrate, and how they used fodder and fuel wood and so on, all kinds of questions about forest use. And the hypothesis here was that if people are migrating, then that could change the household's dependence on forests as more income comes into the household or even as households leave the landscape. So what we found was nothing of the sort. Is this? Yeah, nothing of the sort. We found that in this landscape, and I know this is very different than the dynamics in Karnataka or Andhra Pradesh or other places or the Himalayas and certainly Nepal. In this landscape, people are migrating seasonally. They are, one family member might leave for 3, 4, 6 months a year to work in cities, but the whole household is not moving to cities. Very, very few households that actually have migrated as an entire household. This is seasonal migration where people are going and then coming back for the planting season. So they'll be gone for Diwali to Holi kind of time frame. Very little permanent migration. And people are going really far to Bangalore, to all over, to cities all over the country. Not a lot of international migration, but all over the country. And we see this concentration of migration in this particular area that is located around forests. And we also learned that the households which have members who are seasonally migrating are the poorest households. They are the most vulnerable households, and the migration is certainly not of a kind of aspirational variety. It's of a need to get that little bit of income, which is going to help that household. So it's not by choice or by desire, it's by real need. So here, going in with our naive notion of this Western narrative about forest transitions, we found nothing that supported that hypothesis. We found that in terms of the differences between migrating and non-migrating households, there was no difference in the time spent collecting fuel wood. There was no difference in the time spent collecting forest products. There was no difference in LPG ownership. The migrating households, in fact, spent more time collecting fodder, maybe representing that these are the poorer households. So our original idea that migration could relieve the pressure on the forest does not hold up at all in this landscape. It may hold up in other landscapes in the country, but certainly not in this landscape. So if this urban transition is not going to be reducing pressure on the forests, and there's a lot of pressure on the forests, what will? So what are the strategies that might reduce these local pressures on forests in this landscape? One big trend that we're seeing, and this is work done by one of my students, Sarika Kanwilkar, analyzing the survey data, is that this last Ujjwala scheme, since 2016, has penetrated very far. Households which previously relied completely on fuel wood now have LPG, and you probably see it in your landscapes as well. And in fact, people from the survey data shows that households that have had the LPG for longer are actually spending less time collecting fuel wood, although there is clearly considerable amount of fuel wood use. So people are fuel stacking, using multiple sources of fuel wood. So while this scheme seems to be reaching populations that were not reached in previous schemes. So that's somewhat of a good news, although it's still expensive, and then people not filling their cylinders and all of those issues that we hear about. But there does seem to be at least LPG ownership and access to LPG in marginalized communities at a rate that was not happening before. So that's a bit of good news. So that's one way to reduce pressure on the landscape. Another is related to work that one of my other students, Pooja Choksi, is doing, is about restoration of degraded lands. So this is work with FES, Foundation for Ecological Security, that works with local communities to remove lantana to restore forest, restore common community forests, and make them usable for the communities, also working with the communities for their rights. So what Pooja is doing is really interesting, and Vijay, who's sitting right there, is doing the same kind of work in his landscapes in the Western Ghats to use bioacoustics, to use recorders, to assess the difference in the vocalizing biodiversity between restored sites, which have had sort of intensive effort to restore them, and unrestored sites. So what you're seeing here is a spectrogram, which is showing the frequencies through time that are recorded by these little gizmos that Pooja has put up in trees. So I'm not sure if this is going to work, but we're gonna try this. I think we might have to be quiet to see if we can hear this. Could you play the top one, please? This might work, it might not. So that's the unrestored site. It doesn't sound too bad. We have birds, we have insects. Definitely some biodiversity there. Now let's hear could you play the bottom one, please? So you can hear a lot more complexity. You can see it in the spectrogram that there's a lot more complexity in the soundscape. There's a lot more frequencies that are being filled. And this is just one comparison, but this is this approach to use the bioacoustics to look at the biodiversity from these restored versus these unrestored sites. In addition to what Pooja's doing, looking at the access to fuel wood and grazing and the ability for people to actually get utility out of these restored sites. So this is an enormous amount of work, enormous effort on the community itself, and it's with the extensive lantana and degraded landscapes, it's a very big lift, but there's some real positive signs from these restoration activities. Another big effort is reforesting agricultural land. Here's a little experiment from my land to plant native species on pretty badly degraded rice paddy. And the importance here is to be able to source the native saplings, and also to have the local people, the people who you see there on your right, who have this incredible knowledge about the native trees and how to plant them and how to take care of them. And that's also a big effort to undertake that activity. So all of these things, whether it's LPG, restoring degraded land, reforesting agricultural land, are all big investments. They take a lot of effort, and it's what we need to do to save the forest. In addition to more landscape scale, so we have the issues of connectivity that we spoke about this morning, the issues of mines, the issue of all the big infrastructure that is bearing down on this landscape. And here, I don't know if any of you have been over the NH7, the 1 kilometer long corridor that is the result of the elevated overpass that is a result of 12 long, hard years of litigation. So an amazing amount of work going into saving forests in this, and wildlife and biodiversity in this landscape. So my conclusion from all of this is this notion that urbanization is going to be some kind of great solution, easy solution that will move people off dependence of forest resources is not really something that we can rely on, that we need to continue to do the really hard work of restoration and accommodating infrastructure and fighting for the overpasses and all of that hard work. And there really is no easy way out. So I thank you very much and look forward to any questions.